Hey, I thought I'd do a real quick rundown on my kind of informal, non-scientific finish test. And by all means, this is not a perfect test, and there's several, many things I got to do differently to evaluate things. But this was just for me to look at where I've been having some finish failures on, or not failures, imperfections, problems on stools specifically more than the chairs. And I think the stools basically, it's that concentration of weight, heat, and a little bit of moisture that we just put directly down on them in a relatively small space. Whereas on chairs, I think you're spreading it out more, distributing your weight differently and stuff like that. But so the standard for my test was I used Baltic birch plywood. I sanded them to with a DA to 120, 180, and then hand sanded to 220. So that, and I did them all at the same time so that they were uniform as far as the surface prep went. Baltic birch, probably not a perfect way to simulate what it would be clear coat on a, say, a cherry stool or something like that, just in that it will absorb differently. But it maybe is going to allow me to isolate the finish more rather than the material. But it won't absorb the same into the layers of veneer as it would on the solid wood. But anyway, at least it gave me a uniformity. So that was my material. I did 4 coats over 4 days, and did burnished them, sanded them, whatever your terminology is for that, with fine Scotch-Brite type steel wool in between each day's coats, and then went from there. And then I allowed them to dry for at least 21 days, 3 weeks plus, almost 4 weeks before I subjected them to any testing. And so initial observations is dry time is king. That's probably the biggest thing I'll take away from it is noticeable difference in what I've been getting by letting them dry 2 or 3 days and putting them into use, as opposed to 21, 27, 28 days, whatever it was. And the other observations are my poly tung oil mixes, or poly, any of the mixes with poly, there is some separation, so they do need to be stirred as opposed to spar varnish, and spar varnishes are darker, although that didn't really translate in a way that I could see on my samples, no, as far as the color goes. And then other observation is that I'm testing the wax oils as well. The Osmo Poly Oil, Poly-X oil, 311 is what I used. And then the Oldies oil, which is a new one to me, and content-wise, they really don't give you ingredients. So, but these do contain wax. Then my other tests were, I mixed polyurethane oil-based Helmsman Minwax with tung oil and mineral spirits, and also the exact same polyurethane with boiled linseed oil and mineral spirits. And then spar varnish, also Minwax, Helmsman brand, with tung oil and boiled linseed oil combinations. And those were in equal parts. And one thing I noticed that was kind of a surprise to me is all of them, or both combinations, whether it was the poly or the spar with boiled linseed oil, built up quicker and did a little bit more grain filling than the poly or the spar with tung oil. So now maybe the poly or the tung oil being a little thinner, you get a little bit deeper penetration, but as far as viscosity goes, the boiled linseed oil, at least the particular can I had, just is a little bit thicker, and so it filled quicker, so I ended up with a better feeling initial finish out of the boiled linseed oil combinations as opposed to the tung oil combinations in there. And as far as best finish prior to any testing at the end of 4 days, without a doubt the Osmo was the absolute tops. Feels just silky smooth. You get a really good finish quickly. I've been using this for quite a while on a lot of things, and I do love it. And you really, it's probably the least color shift of anything you will see. It's really a nice clear finish. The Otis, again, new to me, is kind of an observation on it, is I keep my rags, my application rags, and for safety I let them dry on the slab, separated from anything else for fire hazard concerns, until they dry, and then I either burn them or throw them out. And all of the rags hardened on the first few days, I noticed, but I'd had these rags that were not, and I wasn't keeping track of what rag was what, but I was using them individually so I didn't have any cross-contamination. So I noticed that it's the Otis rags don't harden. So it has a very high wax content, and this one is 4 or 5 plus weeks now, and it's still damp to the touch. I actually get some residue off of it. So anyway, that's just a note, and because of that, yeah, I had about the worst. It had like the lowest initial finish quality, and I think it's because of that non-hardening that normal amount of raised grain that you get with that first application doesn't harden, so you don't have the opportunity to sand it off or burnish it off or steel wool it off or whatever method you're using. So after about the first coat, you really don't see a huge surface or finish improvement, quality improvement. So given identical preparation, this had about the lowest initial finish quality. Now I can see applications for it, food surface applications, stuff like that, where it's really great, and I also see them within their feed on their different social media where they're using it, where they're sanding out to a very, very high smooth surface, and I can see it would be awesome there. So that's just an observation in this combination, not necessarily trying to condemn it or whatever, but that's how I had it. All right, then my started destruction sort of test. I wanted to get that heat, moisture, and weight. So what I did was I sprayed them with water, very just light misting, applied a cotton towel, then I put a heating pad set on low and 35 pounds of gravel within a bag to concentrate that. And I don't know if that is that's probably harsher than the human body would be on it, and the surface temperatures were around 80 to 85. I left that for 1 hour. Out of that test, the lowest finish turned out to be, or the one that suffered the most damage, was the Otis, or excuse me, the Osmo. Noticeable raised grain. I don't know if you'd be able to hear it, but there's a roughness. So it went from the best finish to about the most damage. A lot of raised grain and bumpiness to it. The Otis, similarly, the finish quality deteriorated, and I think with both of these having wax in them, the combination of that heat and moisture plus the weight softens that wax, and potentially moisture can penetrate through it, and it gets to those lower grain levels. Then both spar varnish combinations, both the boiled linseed oil and the tung oil, similarly suffered a little bit of moisture getting through that surface after an hour, and a little bit of raised grain, not to the degree that the Otis or the Osmo did. And then the best performing out of those was both of the poly combinations, although the poly boiled linseed oil, this particular sample did noticeably better than the poly tung oil mix. So as a result of that test, for my stools, I'm definitely using the poly boiled linseed oil and mineral spirits mix. And then I also did, since I had the scraps, I did the kind of a cold cup deal where I spritzed them again with water, threw a cup on them, had them nice and wet, left a cup on it, a heavy cup overnight. And they all suffered, all of the combinations of the oils suffered rings. They had rings in the morning, noticeable rings. Although now, 2 weeks later, I wanted to wait and do this review. All of those rings are gone. They've completely disappeared. I can't see them. But initially, the Osmo and the Otis, absolutely no, didn't suffer any ring, any marking from that wet cup left on them all night long. So again, that's a cool temperature scenario. and they repel moisture great in that. So anyway, I think that's about it. A little bit long-winded. This will translate differently when it's over the top of milk paint potentially, stuff like that. But it gave me the knowledge that I want to go forward. And my combination of this poly boiled linseed oil mineral spirits has already been used on a walnut set, and you can see it's a little bit darker. And I don't know if I said it, but the poly mixes are lighter in color than the spar varnish, and I think I covered that. But I don't see any noticeable color shift really on any of these. But anyway, that's about it. Thanks.